said, now so what? What are the practical, pragmatic significance? Because there will always be the scientists and there will always be the engineer. They figure it out, and then we have to engineer the solutions to this thing. And particularly my form of engineering involves both my engineering background, which you heard, but also 36 years in the United States military. And they actually are connected, and that's what I'm supposed to talk about, I think, here today. The pictures you'll see are from my last tour in Afghanistan. It's a very good place to talk about environmental security, the impact that environments have on the humans. So, I started this work in the middle 90s when I was teaching at West Point, putting my two pieces together, my environmental interests and my military background. And I recognized, as many people had been publishing for many years, that there are things, environmental issues, that are of such significance that they impact peace and security in the world. So they become stressors or risks that I have to address as a military person. And that's environmental security in a nutshell. And people have been studying that for a long time. Now, I thought my job as a scientist and an engineer for the United States Army was to kind of explain the processes that were involved and the risk associated with key environmental factors that I saw as stressing many parts of the world today. Climate change was one of those, but not the only one. A point I will make, if there wasn't climate change, I think you'll understand as I go through, there are still environmental issues that are going to be significant challenges to peace and security in the world, primarily driven by population growth. Climate change makes all of those worse. All right. So my first job is to convince the military that they need to pay some attention to it. And let me get a quote for you to recognize my challenge. I teach at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. In fact, I'm the dean out there. One of the great military strategists and writers is a guy named B.H. Liddell Hart. We all study what he says throughout the world. This is what Hart says about my challenge. The only thing harder than getting a new idea into the military mind is getting an old one out. So that's where I started with this. And he's right. He should know. So I had to figure out what is the context that military will recognize that environmental challenges are security challenges. And I went back to fundamentals. We all, in the military, the first thing we do is we raise our right hand and we take an oath. That oath is to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It goes on and on and on. So if you really think about it directly, there is a constitutional requirement for us to recognize the linkage. And it comes actually out of the Declaration of Independence, if you go back. What did it say? What was the reason that we would fight with the British? I sometimes give this talk and I talk about what in the world is worth fighting for. This is what we said was worth fighting for with the British. And we kind of got along with them most of the time. We're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. These are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think those are still true today as they were then. And also they're hierarchical. First, life. And if you provide the life-sustaining conditions that everybody needs, then you can worry about liberties. And then you can move to the highest level, which would be pursuit of happiness. Social scientists studied this, and a guy got a whole bunch of awards named Maslow for writing Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. He broke it into 7 pieces, but it's exactly the same concept. If you don't have life-sustaining things, you don't move up the hierarchy. That is the fundamental issue here that we have to deal with. That is what constitutionally we're supposed to provide to the people of the United States. Protection from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And providing life, liberty, and happiness. So what are those hierarchy? Life-sustaining conditions is a basic human pursuit. Life-giving, I list as these things. Food, water, air that is clean and safe, basic energy needs, the absence of the disease, some very, very basic safety things. Okay? That seem reasonable? Then you would go on to the liberties, and you could fill in the blanks there. But culture, religion, government, those kinds of things. People cannot start thinking about those until they get the first group that are provided by the environment. The air, land, and water are the basis for the life-sustaining things that everybody needs. I'm sort of happy to learn any time about that. Now here's a piece of data that I use. I was born in 1949. 1950, there were 2.5 billion people on the earth. In my generation, that is threefold. There's 7.2 billion people on the earth today. That's a significant challenge in many places in the world. But here's the real question to that. Where in the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness are most of the people in the world? $3.5 billion people a year die from dirty water. Billions don't have enough clean water. Lack of basic sanitation, which produces disease, which is debilitating for a society. A sick society uses up all of their resources just trying to stay healthy. There is no way to advance up the hierarchy. More than 1 billion people are chronically hungry from either the lack of ability to grow food in the place they're at, or the lack of ability to sustain themselves in the way they have been accustomed for hundreds and hundreds of years. So the bottom line is, out of the 7.2 billion people, many more than half are struggling on a day-to-day basis to provide life-sustaining conditions. Now, as you've just heard a very good description of the science, climate change is making that harder and harder for more and more people. That's why it's a security issue. Because without those basic human needs, people have to change where they live, how they live, and what are their choices as the world gets more and more crowded. Very few, very few. So, environmental security, climate security, is well described by this guy right here, Norman Myers, when he wrote in 1986. To the military, he was talking to us at that time. National security is just fighting, not just fighting forces with wetlands, croplands, forests, genetic resources. Climate, notice he put that in there in 1986, before it was in vogue. Now some good news. Everything that we do in the military and the national security interest has to be defined in what's called the National Security Strategy. The President writes that on a 2, 3, 4-year cycle. It tells everybody that's involved in national security within the government what the risks and threats are that we need to address. In 2010, the national security stated that danger from climate change is real, urgent, and severe. I'll let you read the rest. So pragmatically, we in the military have been given a mission to address climate change and recognize the threats that they pose and be ready to respond to protect the peace and security of the United States. But the broader message is peace and security, any place in the world, is important for our national security interests. Because without that, then we go to conflict. And just like any environmental mess that you've got, it's much, much, much more expensive to try to clean up a mess than it is to try to prevent it, mitigate it, in some way react to it before it goes too bad. And that's what we should be doing with climate change and other environmental security issues. So, now I have just been through the new climate report that Johan works on, and I'll have to admit, I haven't read all 2,216 pages that were just issued. But I did go through the 36 pages pretty carefully to do the strategic analysis. What are the impacts of climate change, and what are the threats to security they create? And that's what I want to talk about the last little bit that I have. Now recognize, as a military person, I look at this data in two ways. And Johan presented the data beautifully. That's as well presented as you will hear. There are the actual facts that have been measured. How has the climate changed? How has precipitation changed? How has sea levels risen or fallen? How has the ice and snowpack changed? And what are the changes to extreme weather? The actual measured conditions. Because whether it's climate change or not, those are real, and I have to react to them and prepare for them to figure out what the security threats are and what the military response should be to them. So, temperature rise. The global issues become food security, disease, loss of arable lands. For sea level rise, billions of people are affected. Millions of environmental refugees can be created because of sea level rise. Let me give you an example of why. You were told I'm a member of the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change. One of the real stars of that used to be the Chief of Staff of the Bangladeshi Army, a 2-star general. And he points out the case of Bangladesh. It's 175 million people. It's a country completely surrounded by India and the ocean on the south side of the river. Most of the people in Bangladesh live on this great river delta, very, very close to the sea. If sea level rise comes anywhere close to what's predicted at 2100, he estimates that 35 to 40 million people will be displaced by sea level rise alone. Not counting for the other adverse effects of, for example, the typhoon that just hit that area and will kill thousands and thousands of people. Where do 40 million people from Bangladesh go if they can no longer live in the delta because they don't have the water because the land gets inundated by flooding? Well, India considered that problem, and their answer was they fenced the country off. They went around Bangladesh and put up the fence. I don't think it's to keep Indians from visiting Bangladesh. I'm just assuming. That's an example of sea level rise. Loss of the ice mass in the cryosphere, and Johan talked about that. That's one that's particularly worrisome for us. And what we're really talking about is the water balance in many places of the world. The Tibetan ice cap is one that's really, really of interest to us. That's the ice and snow that's stored in the mountain ranges. The reason that's really, really important to us, in that region of the world, directly affected by the water that comes off of that ice cap and snow melt, is 2.1 billion people of the 7 billion people in the world. Now, if you count the countries that are affected by that, the population affected goes up to 3.8 billion people. The Chinese, the Indians, the Pakistanis, it goes even down to Vietnam, Cambodia. All of those countries are served by the 8 major rivers that come off of that huge ice cap. It's not only how much water they have, but it's when they get the water. And both of those things are changing right now by what we have seen already. And the predictions, that's the second half of what we have to deal with. The predictions of what's going to happen between 2050 and 2099 are even less favorable for the continuing water resources in that part of the world. Precipitation patterns change. How much it rains and when it rains affects water availability, sanitation, food impacts, and goes back to sustaining basic human needs. And I think we're going to get an example of a close-to-home example of those kinds of things that affect us in our ability to produce as we have in the past. And then extremes of weather. Those are the primary areas of concern that are outlined in the IPCC work. Each one has a very, very significant impact. The last one, for example, change in extreme weather. One of the things that I have done routinely in my military career has been to respond to human tragedy. Rwanda, Lyman, Colorado, Bangladesh and the floods there, the Sudan in Africa. Those are the kind of places I get to go to when human tragedy gets driven normally by what we call natural disasters. But are they really natural disasters if we are affecting the rates that they occur at, and the intensity that they occur at, and the number of people that are more and more at risk? And I'm not going to go over that data. I just wanted to show you one quick one. This is a case study because water is very much in vogue right now. And I've had students from the Nile River Basin at the College of Command and General Staff from Egypt and South Sudan. what I'm showing here is the watershed of the Nile River. And what you see over here on the left-hand side, that's where the rain falls. The rain falls on the bottom end of the thing. Those are the three major rivers that form the Nile River. Those are on the right. We won't go over the numbers. But what happens is what you figure out is all the water is deposited from precipitation on the lower half in Ethiopia, in South Sudan, Uganda, and down here in this part of the world. And all the water is used in Sudan and Egypt. Kind of a funny one here is Egypt measures how much water it has in the Nile at the bottom of the Aswan Dam. Aswan, Egypt, is the 5th driest place in the world. But everything that keeps Egypt alive is measured right there. And that's the water in the Nile. Now here's the scary part. Right now there are 265 million people that are competing for 143 billion cubic meters of water. In just 30 years, in 2050, that population is going to triple. What climate change says is the amount of water in the river is going to decrease. And they're already at the maximum capacity of the river in their use of that water. So that leaves 400 million people without water in one of the most arid lands that you've ever seen, in Sudan and in Egypt. Is that going to be a security risk for that part of the world? Sometimes I say, is that going to destabilize that part of the world? And I absolutely assure it's not. It's already unstable. But it can get worse. And it will get worse if the population continues to grow and the water resources react in the way we expect them to. Some of it driven by climate change, but also driven by population. And I always end with this one. This is my favorite environmental cartoon of all time. There's 3 basic things wrong in this cartoon, and I think 2 of them are intentional, absolutely. First of all, it's culturally illiterate. If you understand any Spanish at all, yo amigo is all messed up. Second, as Johan just described, you got to protect us from the greenhouse effect. That's scientifically wrong. Greenhouse effect is good. It's enhancing the greenhouse or accelerating the greenhouse that's bad. But the biggest thing that's wrong with this, the whole thing is that this cartoon was drawn in 1984. And it's still just as funny and just as true as it was at that time. And we've made pretty much no progress at being able to recognize the issues and deal with them. So thank you all for your attention, and I go on to the next.
Thank you.